Prepared a busy presentation for you guys with many primary files. We're going to explore a problem kind of in a linear fashion, exposing the oral traditions of the Métis in the Outaouais region. So basically, we are exploring an article that Guillaume Marcotte, historian of the fur trade, and myself did. In response to allegation, we will explore that the Métis people in the eastern provinces of Canada didn't have any living tradition. Here we get a kind of an image of a picture we found at the Archives of Canada. This is the les écluves, as we say in English. What's the word for écluve, Marcel? Marcel is gone already. The locks, he said 10 minutes, that's over for me, game over, I'm going to go outside, right? So anyways, that's the lock of Ottawa. Around in the 1800s, you can see there a beach bark canoe with two individuals in the canoe with fur trade / indigenous clothing, including the red here for the sash, as well as the usual dress of the voyageur, hats. We will suspect here Métis or Algonquins, or perhaps even French Canadians, canoers on this image. So I've used that as a backdrop. We found that in the archives while we were working. So you're going to see a couple of circles appear in terms of the linearity of my presentation today. I have to give a warning in terms of the subject matter of this presentation, as you must know, is subject to political dispute as well as academic dispute, even sometimes online dispute about this subject. I'm going to try as much as I can to cover the material objectively and for you to come to your own conclusion on this subject matter. So first, the community that we're speaking about in this paper on Marie-Louise Riel, as we will see, a figure well known among the Métis Elders in Maniwaki and in the north of the Outaouais, is part of the community Métis Autochtone de Maniwaki. Here you can see a small image of the chief Serge Paul of their community. There you have their registering as an organization as well as their patent letter. They were created in 1969, registered in 1976. I'm guessing the year I was born myself. Called it then Alliance Autochtone Locale 18. As we will see, this will have incidence per the evidence that we're going to present. And at first, they had 100 of members when separating from the Alliance des Autochtones du Québec, an organization that regrouped Métis and non-status so-called Indians. In 2005, they had over 4,000 members in their organization. Okay? So this is just to give a quick topo, and we're going to wheel back to that community by the end of my presentation. It's going to be around 40-ish, 35-ish minute presentation, I'm hoping, and for a period of question after this. I can see that my uncle and good friend Marcel Labelle is better dressed than myself today. That I must say, I didn't put a jacket. Sorry, uncle. I know, I left it in the truck running. I apologize. So the location of the community of Maniwaki from an historical perspective, these maps are a credit of Guillaume Marcotte, who made these maps, by the way. So I have the possibility here of zooming, I'm assuming, like I do home, right? So we can see the better region of that map. We are located right here ourselves. You have Sault Ste. Marie here, you have Kingston, Montreal, and it is within that location that the community of Maniwaki found itself. There's the Abitibi Fort, most factories. So these are Compagnie de la Baie du Son, or Hudson Bay Company fort. So, cousins, please don't spit. So basically here you have a closer zoom on the region that we're exploring, Lac Sainte-Marie, Maniwaki, Rivière-des-Airs, and Lac des Sables. This is the triangulation where we did our research in the archives and all the documents pertaining to this. This is the main area that we have researched, but we've also found evidence in Fort Coulonge, La Passe, as well as Lac des Allumettes here. So there's also a lot of activities per Métis cultural events and evidence in that region. Now, if I do that, yes, it works perfectly. And finally, one last zoom of the region. You have the Lac Sainte-Marie here that we're going to speak about in terms of the evidence. So you can locate it right now, Lac du Poisson Blanc, where Riel was reputed to travel during his exile and his hiding, according to the oral story of Marie-Louise Riel, which we're going to see in an instant. So Lac du Poisson Blanc is right there. And you can see the configuration of the river. It makes kind of a circle, if you will, right? You can go up north, you can cross around, and you can go back down south by a river's waterway. So there's a freedom of movement that these rivers and lakes allowed in that area that we must notice for the future. Now, let's swing right into the polemic of this subject of me, as well as other researchers such as Guillaume Marcotte, Michel Bouchard, Denis Gagnon, and other researchers, that there are Métis, historical Métis in Quebec and in the eastern part of Ontario. Now, there has been strong detractor of this, suggesting that there's absolutely no Métis in Quebec, that this would be in fact a mistake, that what we call Métis is in fact cultural appropriation of an identity that would belong only in the western prairies. And so there's a few academic arguments that have been crafted around this line of thoughts. And some of these arguments I'm going to display here, just a few journal of articles and people that are pretty vocal on social media as well as in their work against the presence of Métis in the eastern provinces of Canada. You recognize here perhaps Dr. Adam Gaudry, the blogger Chelsea Vowell also, and the author of the book Métis, Dr. Chris Andersen from the University of Alberta. In fact, this book is the most succinct defense, if you will, of that argument that Métis is only a Western phenomena linked to nationalisms, in fact, Red River nationalisms. And as we will see, per the argument of Chris Andersen, only the Red River Métis or their descendant or that diaspora should call themselves Métis. Now, I'm just going to resume these arguments in 4 times so that we can move ahead in terms of the evidence and the presentation of the problems at the center of my article. So one of the arguments is that there's no national or political consciousness in other Métis communities that we can, or mixed origin, as some scholars would prefer to call them, other communities across Canada. So the argument kind of suggests that there is no classic historiography that would describe this community as having political behaviors that would be noticeable by outsiders as well as insiders to call themselves Métis or to act politically in terms of collectively in terms of Métis. This argument is found in Jean-Claude Peterson, for example, scholars of the fur trade, that at first was suggesting that there are Métis communities in Ontario and in the Great Lake region, but later influenced by the work of Chris Andersen, she recanted her previous work and said that in the Great Lake area, these were not Métis, but only half-breeds, between quotes, and that the real Métis would be somewhere more west in terms of this political narrative that suggests that if you don't have the historical circumstances by which you have become a nation, then you're not an indigenous people. You could be mixed, you could be a lot of things, but you're certainly not, according to these people, Métis. There's also scholar Paul L.A.H. Chartrand, Chris Andersen, as I said, and Adam Gaudry that are defending this line in terms of their scholarship. A second argument that you see here is that there is no historical community that have been recognized in Quebec right now, for example, or in the eastern provinces of Canada, such as Nova Scotia. What I'm suggesting by this is that there has been, since the inclusion of the Métis in the Constitution in 1982, the Métis are part of the indigenous people counted for in the Constitution with the so-called labeling of Indians still, and the Inuit. The Métis form one of these categories, and that was officially recognized, as I said, in 1982. Now, in 2003, there has been a trial called the Pauli trial, which kind of assessed what would be the collective rights of the Métis, this case relating to Steve and Rodney Pauli going hunting in the area of Sault Ste. Marie, killing a moose, or harvesting, I should say, a moose out of season. They've put their status card at this point. They had like a OMA, a Métis organization plastic card. They put it on the moose. They identified that this meat was for their own subsistence, and so they were charged. That went on to trial, and up to the Supreme Court it went, and the Supreme Court crafted a test in line with previous jurisprudence, suggesting that the Métis ought to meet the requirement of the Vanderpeet test, for example, and the Métis, because they're outside of treaty, they ought to show that they have a collective existence to have rights recognized by Section 35 of the Constitution of 1982. I hope I'm not losing anyone at this point. So the Pauli test referred to that juridical test developed by the Supreme Court in 2003, and it is now applied across Canada in terms of, at the very least by the government, as its best practice to standardize who would be the Métis communities, the historical communities around Canada that would be the recipient of Section 35 rights. So because people in the eastern provinces of Canada were not able to secure such Pauli tests for themselves along different trials, then the members of the academic communities are recuperating, they're taking this argument and using it against the Eastern Métis to say, if you're not making the Pauli cut or the Pauli test, you're not Métis, you're not able to provide sufficient evidence that you are Métis. Now, a catch-22 right away, if there is the strong possibility that an Eastern community would prevail and win a Pauli case, for example, as we call it in our jargon, most likely the strongest opponent to the Eastern Métis would say, this is colonial interference by Canadian court. We are not recognizing the Pauli criteria because these are given by the so-called, between brackets, the white man's court to assess Indigenous identity, and we don't respect that. So sometimes it's a double-edged sword. If you win, then you are embedded into the colonial rationalities and jurisprudence. And if you lose, then this is used as a proof that you were not sufficient in your evidence to prove that you're an Indigenous or a Métis community. Now, there's the argument that these communities, like I said, are only mixed on the biological level, which means that they don't have, and this will be the core of our argument today, they don't have genuine cultural transmission in terms of, in this case, oral tradition. So basically, it is suggested by scholars, as we will see, including Dr. Chris Andersen from the University of Alberta, that the Eastern Métis are so obsessed by making themselves look as Métis in order, most likely, in their opinion, to gain rights and other form of psychological explanation as to their behaviors of self-indigenization. Basically, it is assumed that because the Eastern Métis are so obsessed by crafting that new identity that they would go into archives and dig very distant ancestors, and they will say, well, I have this Indigenous ancestor in my line, therefore I'm a Métis, and so on. So for Chris Andersen, as I best understand his argument, this, it's not a genuine living transmission of surviving Métis community. It is hungry ghost in the archives. And as we will see, Dr. Chris Andersen makes even comparison with zombies that would come back to life and hurt the Métis nation to hijack its identity, so to speak. So that's another types of argument that also connect to that other line, which false Métis are in fact willing to usurp the rights of real Indigenous peoples around. And so this has been argued by, for example, Darryl LaRue and Chelsea Vowell in one of their research. And basically what it suggests is that these Métis in the eastern province of Canada are not real Métis. They are in fact white supremacist, covert white supremacist group, angry against the First Nations for any gain they would make in terms of access to territories or securing their own rights. So therefore, these people are using the Métis trope, so to speak, to hijack and oppose the rights of real Indigenous communities. So I hope I'm making justice as much as I can to these types of arguments that are going around. Now I have create 2 more templates before we move bubbles, so to speak, and this one will be not controversial, but I have to explain the backdrop of that scholarship, which is not only a scholarship that we're seeing in university and in schools, but it's also linked to political organizations that have been created in 1983. Remember that I said that the Constitution in 1982 recognized the Métis constitutionally? So at that time, the movement of the Métis and the non-status was united and spearheaded by a Métis leader called Harry Daniels. So at this point, what happened is that after the constitutional recognition, if you will, there has been a break in the movement of the Métis and the non-status, and differences of views, as I can understand from the document I have consulted. And there has been a split from the Western, like parts of the Western Métis formed their own organization called the Métis National Council in 1983, starting this ideology that only them were the right and the real Métis, so to speak. That other people might be non-status Indians or whatever they wanted, but only them represent the real Métis people, hence their name, the real Métis Nation. So these scholars have sometimes views that are connected to these political organizations. That's why I'm speaking about these. Now I have a reference to a French article here, but I'm sure you can relate or translate. It's an article that suggested that Robert Doucet, ancient president of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, is in fact recognizing that there is Métis in Quebec and wished to create a relationship with Quebec in that regard, but that is vehemently opposed by other people within the MNC organization, including the President Chartier, as well as the President of MMF Chartrand, strongly opposed. It's no secret, you can find that on Google, online, on their website, that they opposed any claims that would say that there's Métis in the eastern provinces of Canada, including Quebec, including this region, which we're talking about today. So this is just a map to show you that that's one of the maps that we've seen around that would include the traditional territories of the Métis as they unfold from the Red River settlement, and after that they kind of explode in different directions. And you see that this limits Quebec pretty in a straightforward line, right? In a strange line for a lot of us that knows the waterways and know the cultural connection, but there's a cutoff for Quebec, and Quebec at this point is excluded as a huge section of BC, as well as the East Coast, is excluded from what would be the Métis National homeland, so to speak. And this is important. Why? Well, this is important because, like, if your ancestor fall outside of that territory, for example, then you cannot make a claim with that organization that you are a Métis person. You cannot receive their card, their recognitions, as well as their privilege granted by the government, which now recognize the Métis National Councils as almost one of the only organization representing Métis with the Congress of Aboriginal People. So basically all the other independent communities around at this point are struggling to get recognitions and get services that are offered to the Métis National Council. This is why this is important, right, at this point. So that politics aside, there's a letter in 2018. I wanted to show you this letter. It's pretty recent, by the president of the Métis National Council. I've highlighted a section here that I'm going to read just to make some of the connections between the scholarly work and the political organization, because they're not disjoint, right? There's a number of academic that are embedded into these politics. So here at the end of the quote, we have, for example, that connects to the previous critique we have said, Professor Daryl Leroux of St. Mary University, in Halifax briefed the policy forum on the evolution of these groups, some of which are rooted in the white rights, white nationalist movement, end of quote. So basically you can see here that Professor Daryl Leroux is suggesting, not only in his academic work, but also to Métis political organization, that the Eastern Métis, here the word some is used, you know, for full disclosure, but that a number of Métis organization in the Eastern province of Canada would be covered white supremacist organization, in fact. So we're facing these kinds of criticism in the field right now, and the connection is pretty straightforward in terms of academic work and political organization that are struggling with others in terms of what constitutes Métis identity at this point. So this is really important to understand the backdrop of that conversation, because then we can understand or better understand the heated debate that we find, for example, online or in other places. Now, as part of this, and I just wanted to show that here, see that map? It has been shortened quite a bit from this map, right? So in 2018, the Métis National Council have decided to shrink their map and cut off a huge chunk of Ontario, including the community of Sault Ste. Marie, where the Paoli trial was won in 2003, in order to configure it, their nationhood movement from a stronger perspective, at least from their standpoint. Now, interestingly, Professor Leroux, the same one that suggests that in the Eastern province of Canada, and why I'm suggesting this, it's because Professor Leroux has created a list online of 50 organizations and 50 communities, if you will, in the Eastern province of Canada that would facilitate, according to his public communication, that would facilitate race shifting. So I'm calling your attention to that word, right? Race shifting would be the practices of reinventing yourself as an Indigenous people without any real or tangible proof. So it seems that Professor Leroux is suggesting that his list is composed of 50 organizations that would encourage this kind of race shifting that he criticized quite strongly and quite publicly. Now, for full disclosure, in this list, my own community is listed. I'm part of the Voyageurs Métis from around the Detroit area and the Southern Great Lakes. So he suggests that, for example, in his list, which is now public, so that's why I'm posting it here, the Michigan, Detroit, Windsor region members have been aggressively taking up Aboriginal position on school board and pushing out Anishinaabe Elders, end of quote. So you can see here that these kinds of debate, unfortunately, may slide toward, profiling certain communities. So it's not just individuals that may be guilty of claiming falsely that they are Métis. It's entire communities, including Maniwaki and including mine, that we will speak about today. Now, my community is not a subject of this conversation, but Maniwaki is, and you can find that Maniwaki is also in the list that Dr. Leroux claimed facilitate race shifting in the East. Now, obviously, I have been associated with that critique, but just for our information, as well as Dr. Leroux, if he ever watched this presentation, the school board, the Square had to make a school board retraction in regards to the argument that our claim that elders were pushed off school board and stuff like that. It made the headlines, and the family Leclerc from a community was involved into this. And it is our understanding that the journal has now retracted from these claims, and we invite people to make their own judgment about this. So now, enough with politics. Let's go toward the evidence of it, but at least now you can see how salty that can become and how personal that can be. So we're trying to be as productive as possible within that conversation with a big grain of salt and efforts. So we did an article to respond to these claims that we have grouped that no Métis really existed, that they are only ghosts and zombies, that these people want to abuse Indigenous people. So these claims are really, really hard to debunk because they're based on psychologism, right? So basically, the attribution of psychological intent that are hard to prove or disprove. So basically, when you say those things, it's really harmful for community that are targeted by these because it's hard for them to defend themselves, that's A. And B, I would suggest that the gravity of these accusations are quite steep, because if you say to some people or entire community that they are not Indigenous, that they are not who they claim to be, then this is a shortcut to say that they do not exist, that their culture is not counted or is not true. So these accusations are pretty severe, and that's why Guillaume, Marcotte, and I have decided to write a paper of 40-ish pages. Apologies for that, it's quite a long paper if you read it. And to try to answer a very simple statement from Chris Andersen. Is there any evidence that could refute the statement of Dr. Chris Andersen and his followers pertaining to his accusation that Métis culture in Quebec is non-existent and ghost-like? So this is kind of the place where we started, or kind of investigation, if you will. And we provided in the articles, and I'm just going to show the three part of the articles, we provide an explanation of the current debate leading to accusation of ethnic fraud. So in our article, we provide explanation about the Pauli and the Daniel case in particular. Then after that, we articulate what we believe is the fallacy of the root of neo-nationalisms. For our criticism suggests that neo-nationalist Métis scholars conflate their own narrative with all condition of possibility for Métis ethnogenesis elsewhere in Canada. So basically, we suggest with evidence that there has been a number of communities across Canada that have emerged in different times per different conditions, and that we do not have to take one nationalistic narrative, spin, or discourse and police these communities by that narrative, right? Like, it's fine if individuals and community want to be part of a national movement. It's fine and it's legit, I would suggest, but not to police other Métis or Indigenous communities per their own cultural narrative and understanding of themselves. And after that, third, we first present historical evidence refuting such fallacy in our opinion from Riel in terms of inclusion, from Gabriel Dumont in terms of mixedness, and Valérie Havard on geography. So, and that is just the primer of the article, if you will, right? That is kind of our bait that we're putting forward, right? Riel, Dumont, and finally other evidence that I will show in a second to suggest that there is a narrative that goes in terms of Métis identity beyond this narrow scope of nationalisms as we are seeing today in some circles of the academy. In terms of the strongest accusation that Métis in the East are zombie or ghost-like, there's Chris Andersen that stated this in one interview at CBC. He said, "I've joked that the logic, I'm quoting, contained in this court decision amounted to the coming of the zombie apocalypse, since it raised from the dead the rationalized logic of Métis as mixed that an earlier 2003 case, Pauli had already attempted to put stake in. But as it turns out, zombies are not so easily killed," end of quotation. So you can see here that Dr. Chris Andersen is suggesting that the Eastern Métis, or people claiming that identity, would be comparable to living dead or zombies. And it's not just for him a metaphor. He further developed in that video that you may watch on your own time. Here you can find it. You go at the minute 33 to 33:35, and you will see him saying this quote in bold that in lieu of attachement, I quote, to community, they, the Eastern Métis, they offer two in particular that I find most interesting, two arguments, I would say. The first is archival source, and the second is DNA, and the emphasis is within a non-relational animus. So for Chris Andersen, Dr. Andersen, there's no true relationship at the roots of the Eastern Métis identity, and there's a problem in terms of searching for DNA, which we won't contest here for sure, but the archival source are also a subject of problem for Chris Andersen, suggesting that if the only thing you have are archives, you're not a real Indigenous person. You're like kind of a zombie that needs to go out of the ground and your way to Métis identity, basically. So that is what it is suggested. And so I know that this language may be funny for some of us, but for readers in the Eastern Province of Canada that's self-identified as Métis, these kinds of articles are pretty crude to receive, I would suggest. And it may influence the social debate and as well as the academic debate about what are the evidence of this. So starting from that conversation, or the absence of conversation with Dr. Chris Andersen, Guillaume Marcotte and I started an investigation in terms of, is there any evidence we could put forward that would refute this? Is there anything at all that we may find? Because if Dr. Chris Andersen suggests that there's nothing but archives, and let's be honest, what we do is archival research. If there's nothing else, then we're in trouble, arguably, right? So we needed to find some proof, some evidence of the contrary. And so just to highlight some of the primer that we did, we have here Louis Riel in our article suggesting that there are Métis in the eastern provinces of Canada. He wrote that himself with a similar Indian title, so to speak, than the Métis of Manitoba. So the distinction is well made between the Métis in the eastern province of Canada as well as those of Manitoba. That's one. So you can read that in our article about the sources if you're interested. Now there's Gabriel Dumont, because a lot of people suggest that Métis is more than mixedness, and that mixedness amounts to nothing, which I would kind of disagree with slightly. The valuation of being so-called mixed, which is not just being mixed, it's the valuation of being Métis, of having dual or multiple heritage taken together, have generated this specific and historical form of indigeneity that I understand as Métis. And I think that this is well encapsulated into a quote that we have from the Métis leader Gabriel Dumont, who suggested, and I'm going to quote here, "As long as we have a drop of French and Indian blood in our veins, we will claim the rights for which we fought and for which they have judicially assassinated for Louis David Riel," end of quote. So you can see here Gabriel Dumont is pretty adamant about what constitutes Métis identity, not ashamed of suggesting that there are French and Indians, so to speak, element into that identity. So that would be two. And Havard finally suggested here, we have this quote in our article that suggests that Havard, an ethnologist of the time in 1880, make this long quote about the Métis and try to describe them, suggesting that there's French as well as Anglo-Métis out west, but not only out west. Right here in that paragraph, he said, if we conclude obtained number of Métis in Canada, Ontario and Quebec, that was Canada back in the time, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Labrador, and the northern part of New England, as well as that of the French descendant family tainted with Indian blood in the state of Illinois and Missouri, I doubt not the total would reach at least 40,000 at the strength of the population of French-Canadian mixed blood in North America. So you can see here that the geographic delimitation of the Métis population is quite wide in terms of this. And these three arguments, the arguments of Riel, the arguments of Dumont, and the arguments of Havard, we open our article suggesting that this, in and of itself, is a strong critique of the narrowing view of scholars such as Chris Andersen, as well as others, and the political lines that is suggested by the Métis National Council. Now, that being said, we went extra miles in order to challenge ourselves into that debate, because basically saying this doesn't really give evidence that there is a Métis community with an oral or living tradition that could be found in Quebec, right? Because this is the challenge that we're facing here. We're not just throwing back a ball, we're actually wanting to respond with a demonstration that could be grounded in evidence and sources, if you will. So we discovered at the archive a manuscript of an oral traditions that was recorded in 1980 of Marie-Louise Riel. So we will speak to her in an instant, but here you have a picture that you can find also in the article about that lady that is well known in the upper north region of Maniwaki among Métis Elders that I have visited and interviewed. So the story of her kinship of Louis Riel, we will speak about that in a second. She's recognized as a protector of the Métis and the settlers of the region, as a midwife, as well as a protector of Louis Riel and a bone healer, someone that can fix your bone with different plants and different treatments. There is testimonies about her daughter in the press, identified as a Métis and a relative to Louis Riel. And we will speak about the family pack and testimonies from Métis Elder currently alive, if we can. So I've prepared a few windows here that I'm just going to visit quickly with you in terms of the source of that manuscript. As I just shown, any of my slide that will be public and my conference as well, you can find the sources in the archives where we did find these sources, these documents, so if you want to consult them for yourself. So now, Marie-Louise Riel was a midwife and a healer of her people, called it the Métis. So is there evidence? Yes, there is in the end manuscript that was then typed right after. I've seen the document, the latest document. In her hide pouch, Marie-Louise carried a variety, I quote, of potion for the treatments of a number of ailments such as constipation, asthma, pneumonia, broken bones, and yes, even the birthing of babies. It was not uncommon to find her delivering infants into the isolated home of the pioneers and her people, the Métis. Upon the moment of birth, she would perform a baptism and place the soul of the newborn into the hand of its creator. You know, she never ceased to marvel at the mystery of life, and she never missed a birth. End of quote. So this would describe in the oral story the persona of Marie-Louise Riel, which was considered a midwife, as I said, and a healer. She was also referred by elders that I visited as La Dame de High Fall, which means the Lady of High Fall, because her cabin was next to a high fall, and people still to this day among elders, for them, she's a quasi-sacred figure. Remember it for her medicinal capacities as well as her strength. She was building beach bark canoe herself. She was an independent woman. She was traveling often alone in the bush, and she was never afraid to go at distance to help either the settlers or the indigenous families to deliver babies, as she is recorded among elders that we have visited. So this is the evidence that you may find in the oral tradition. Now, we may stop almost the train right here, but we're going to go at length with these evidence. But with this alone, we can suggest that there is an oral tradition that we can find in the Maniwaki region that answer Chris Andersen, dating back from 1980s, that says to Dr. Andersen, well, it seems that per evidence, we have living memories transmitted from one family to the next, from one generation to the next, that suggests that there is a form of attachment in terms of Métis culture, identity, activities, and traditional activities. So that alone, I would suggest, would be potentially the end of that argument made by Dr. Chris Andersen and others that may suggest that there's nothing alive still to this point in the Maniwaki region. So the daughter of Marie-Louise Riel, per evidence that we found in the press of 1909, was also described there as an half-breed. You can read here, and for your convenience, I have typed the interesting part of that journal article I have typed here for you to better read it on your own terms or for here on the board. In bold are the interesting passage of that article in 1909. So she was the daughter of Marie-Louise Riel, and she was trained as a midwife herself, her daughter, the Lady Valiquette. And Mother Valiquette was born in the Northwest. And the Northwest at that time was not just the Northwest out there, right? It was a wider region engulfing parts of Quebec as well as a sizable chunk of Ontario. Mother Malette was born in the Northwest around 1818. Her mother was a Métis, see the French word here, named Riel, cousin of Louis Riel, and played a certain role in the Northwest, right? So her father was McGregor, was a Scotsman at the service of the Hudson Bay Company, fur trade activities and culture. So there is more description, and for certain illness, they kept her service 15 days a month in advance, and night and day they came hastily to seek this courageous old mother by beach bark canoe, the only way to travel at that time through impossible weather. End of quote. So you can see here that that article of 1909 is basically suggesting the same information that we find in the oral tradition among elders, as well as the information that we find in the manuscript that we found in the archives of Gatineau. So the family pack now, so in the manuscript that recount the life of Marie-Louise Riel, there is description about how she protected Louis Riel, the leader Louis Riel, between 1870 and a period of 10 years, basically that stretch, right? So Louis Riel was in exile after his first resistance. He was traveling in different parts of the country as well as in the United States. And we found evidence that he traveled in the region of the Outaouais. And while in the region of the Outaouais, our article explains that we found evidence by the end of Louis Riel. He writes to his mother and say, yes, I'm in the Outaouais region, and exchange with another folks about the safest road to take, because at this point Louis Riel has a bounty on its head of $5,000 per Prime Minister of Ontario, and there are bounty hunters actively seeking Louis Riel to arrest him if he's in Canada. So that story goes by, let me tell you about the hidden away as told to me by my father, Wilfrid McGregor. Look at the map of Quebec and find the following place. All McGregor Lake, Buckingham, Notre-Dame de la Salette, High Falls, Val-des-Bois, and Maniwaki. With a pencil, connect these locations and you will see that they make a circle formation on the map. This is where my nomadic grandmother, grand-mère, lived, fished, traveled the waterways, worked among the people, and of course hid Louis, her fugitive nephew, from the clutches of the law. Grand-mère McGregor realized that it was important to keep Louis on the move, which well suited her nomadic existence, for she too was constantly on the go. End of quote. So here you see an important part of that story that connects a little bit later on with what they call the family pack in terms of kinship connection that still to this day, per this oral tradition, connects Marie-Louise Riel with the leader Louis Riel as one of his kin. Now in our article, we're pretty transparent about this. We did some research, we did digging in the archives as well as in the BMS documents, which are the birth and marital and death certificate, and we found no actual connection between Jean-Baptiste Riel, the father of the grandfather of Louis Sr., and Marie-Louise Riel. We have found dates by which relatives of Louis Riel were active in Sault Ste. Marie, where Marie-Louise Riel, was reputed to be born. So there's no actual biological connections that we can draw. We don't say they don't exist, but we cannot infer them on the basis of documents at this point that there's a real, genuine biological connection between Marie-Louise Riel and Louis Riel. Now, a lot of detractors have suggested from this information that we gave in our articles that, well, then she's not Métis, right? She's not connected at all to Louis Riel, or there's no way we can prove it. So why is Malette suggesting that this lady is Métis, is just running on something that is quite empty? Well, here's the argument, is that symbolic kinship, especially in the formation of identity, is extremely important, right? The way in which you will think that a number of individuals are your kins, that you regroup into a group, that group is formed around symbolisms and meanings attributed to protecting Louis Riel, the Métis leader par excellence, if you will. So this has meaning in and of itself, right? And a number of other individuals in the Maniwaki region have claimed kinship with Louis Riel, because themselves name Riel often, and we have found that these links can hardly be proven, but the fact remains that these individuals visualize, understand themselves as Métis, right across history, and link themselves with the geste of Louis Riel, arguably. So, so far, so good? Clean enough in terms of presentation? I'm not going too fast. Thumbs up? Okay, thumbs up I like. All right, so at this point, as you will see in the articles, there are more details about the life of Marie-Louise Riel, right, in terms of the narrative she provides, in terms of the evidence she provides, in terms of her life, in terms of her locations. So there's a lot to gain from reading the articles on Marie-Louise in and of itself. But we're still having these problems, and we go again extra miles. Is there something like an historical community in Maniwaki or in the Outaouais region, the western part of Quebec, right, that would amount to something called an historical community? Is there anything at all? Or else, what do we got? We got an oral story. Okay, we can perhaps refute the argument of Chris Andersen and say, you know, one gain in terms of, yes, there are oral tradition, nothing is just about zombies, and nothing is just about ghost-hungry archives. There are actual stories that elders keep telling other people in their community about Marie-Louise Riel, a relative of Louis Riel, that hid Louis Riel in their region. They're really proud of that. They said to me, Louis Riel was traveling on the Lac du Poisson Blanc, and he was going to Maniwaki and then to Hall, and then all these stories are pretty powerful stories for these people. So again, there is a living culture in Maniwaki by that tradition alone. But is there anything to prove an historical community? Because if not, then perhaps the only thing we have is an oral tradition. I mean, our detractors are pretty, how can I put it? Hard to convince, let's put it that way, okay? Hard to convince in terms of the evidence that we may present. I mean, they're not happy most of the time with the evidence that we have suggested forward. Most likely, we can assume, because it is not a comfortable position to make assertion that some people do not exist, and after that being confronted with evidence that there is in fact a history and a culture and presence. So we have criticized primordialisms as a philosophical position and neo-nationalisms as a rhetoric from the standpoints of historical realities in our work and the work that we're still doing now. So to do that, in order to prove an historical community in Maniwaki, Guillaume Marcotte and I, as well as Dr. Michel Bouchard, we went into the archives for more than 2 years, which is not a lot of time, but 2 years. Guillaume Marcotte did work in the archives of the Hudson Bay Company for more than 10 years. And we've summed up and gathered an amount of material by which we had sufficient evidence that there was or there is something going on in terms of historical Métis community in the region of Maniwaki that we have shown on our map. Now, in order to do that, we had to have a methodology. Apologies, right? We had to have like a more sturdy and comparative ethnological analysis. So we've based our work on a comparative analysis and comparative basis, if you will, on the review of reports and cartographic representation pertaining to historical Métis in Ontario by Raymer and Chartrand. So these scholars have developed a grid, and we have been inspired by that grid, and we have created our own grid, so to speak, right? And I'm just going to show it here. So these are the scientific criteria, if you will, by which we have kind of made our research stand. So we see here, for example, mention of mixed origin is one. Then you see shared experience as individual is 2. Cultural recognitions by other or by oneself is 3. Social structures such as kinship is 4. Political and ideological element is 5. Geographic element including geographic proximity is 6. Cultural elements including material, culture, language, music, celebration is 7. And then Métis ethnonym, we have added this category because we thought it was important, right? In terms of traditional name giving to the Métis such as Bois Brûlé or Métis, which we can find in the, as we will see per evidence, as we can find in the Maniwaki region. Now, how am I doing in terms of times? Okay. All right, so far, this is the grid that we've used to make comparative analysis between the communities and the evidence that we found in Maniwaki, and we could compare them with, for example, Sault Ste. Marie or Mattawa region or other expertise that have been done either for the courts or by ethnologists in terms of finding historical Métis community. So to go, not far away from the model provided, we wanted to be extra precocious and conservative, if you will, in our approach. So we have adopted this grid to go further into our analysis. Now, there is 3 dimensions at this point that have led us into that methodology, right? We've encountered 3 types of problem that I'm just going to show very quickly here in terms of evidence that we found that suggested that we needed a more sturdy ethnological approach to studying the evidence. Because it's one thing to gather evidence, but you have to have a grid in order to make sense of these evidence, especially when you're seeking a people, arguably, that colonialisms or colonial politics have attempted to suppress for a number of years and per a number of policy. As we will see, the Métis people were not welcome in official colonial policies, and they had many trouble in terms of the last part here to become white or Indian, so they were often excluded from what we can call official Indianness, if you will, So that was some of the problems that we find. These problems, which are historically grounded per evidence, have then led us to have a more sturdy methodology by which makes sense of not only our evidence, but also on a comparative basis by which we can say, here is what we have found in terms of Maniwaki, in terms of the region where Marie-Louise Riel evolved, and we can compare these evidence to other well-recognized Métis community across Canada. So if you recognize Métis in this area, then per the evidence, we can suggest that we should recognize Métis as well in that community. So just a heads up in terms of the name Métis, if you will. This is a letter from Louis Riel to Preux, his cousin, of 1877, without falling down. So this is Riel stating this. It's a name that means mixed, Métis. Until now, it has served to designate the race question of mixed bloods between European and native, but it is equally viable in its usage to designate a race of man recruited from all types of mixtures of blood between them, and who, passing through the French-Canadian mold, this is Riel speaking, not me, to be clear, retain their memory of their heritage and call themselves Métis. Okay? Remember their heritage, retain this, and call themselves Métis. Now, this is Riel in bold. The label Métis is one of the most fine agreeable because it is not exclusive and it has the advantage of recognizing in the most convenient way possible the contingent that derives from each nation to create this new group of people. So from this letter of 1877, we can argue that Riel is suggesting an inclusive way of thinking Métis identity right there. Now, the perceptions of racial shifting, okay? So there has been a number of arguments, including, remember, Dr. Darryl LaRue suggesting that the Eastern Métis are in fact race shifters. He's using a lot of that language on social media as well when he's talking about his research. So basically, I would argue that race shifting is not so much, how can I put it most politely? It's not so much an indicator that these people would be fraud or false. It is linked to the historical condition of the Métis, as we can see per these evidence. So I'm just going to line up here a case for us to discuss that we found in the archives for your convenience. So we have William Paulson, which is labeled as a Métis and of Anglo-Cree heritage from the James Bay. He's a commis and interpreter of the Abitibi Post at some point in his life. His wife is Métis Flora Lévesque, alias Otina Mawink Bellefeuille, in 1838. Father Bellefeuille describes his wife as a sauvagesse among the Métis from the vicinities. So you see here Bellefeuille in 1838 in the region of the Outaouais is using the word Métis, and it would describe the Flora Lévesque as a sauvagesse among the Métis, right in the archives. Now, what is interesting is that the Paulson then moves to the Témiscamingue Lake, right in that region, in 1850, when William Paulson retired. And the same couple is characterized as an Indian couple during the 1871 survey. Okay, so according to that survey, these guys are Indian. According to Bellefeuille, these guys are Métis, or among the Métis. And finally, Father Mournier later described the arrival of these people as the first white family of the lake. So you can see here that these people are sometimes described as Métis, they are described as Indian, and other times they're described as white. Okay? So you can see that these people are not only perceived through different racial categories, but arguably, as we have a stack of evidence showing this, the Métis have sometimes played on the deux tableaux, as we say in French, right? Sometimes they would gain from accessing policy reserves to white, for example, for alcohol, for drinks, for civic freedom that were denied increasingly to the so-called Indians. At other times, they could go and try to find ways to get into a treaty or to gain access to a reserve because they were coming back from the fur trade after the crash of 1821. And they were looking for land or looking for an opportunity to make better for themselves. So sometimes they were claiming their indigenous heritage in order to get there. So this is just to show that historically speaking, condemning the Métis for race shifting in the past is a very weak, we would suggest, understanding of the sociological and historical conditions in which the historical, let alone the current Métis, the historical Métis, Michif, were placed in. And this per the example of only one family. Of course, for these conferences, I've only selected few evidence, right? I couldn't put everything that I had in, so I had to make tough choices in terms of evidence. Now, per excluding the Métis out of official politics, I'm having here a few slides. Gosh, I'm having so much material. I'm trying to pace myself here and being as much as I can polite to you guys. So going back to this, the invisibility of a community. Is it mere assimilation? And then we're going to run into the Robinson Treaty of 1815 Ontario, Sault Ste. Marie, to see the failure of the Métis, and then the exclusion from the Indian Act in 1876, right? So we know per court records, according to Paulé, that the small community of Sault Ste. Marie emerged around 1820, okay, according to Morrison and his expertise. Only 7 of the 51 families recorded in 1850 still live in Sault Ste. Marie in 1881. Only 7 families, okay? On both sides of the river, on top of that, okay? Only 84 Métis heads of household were identified by John Swanson at Lake Superior during the trading post in 1850. So that's a large region. Only 84 Métis families were identified at that time. And after 1850, several Métis families left Sault Ste. Marie for reserves, such as the Betchwana and the Garden River Reserve, to receive annuities because of the signing of the Robinson Treaties and the Penny Feather Treaties of 1859. So what I'm suggesting here is that per evidence, we see that this community has, according to some people, disintegrate, essentially, right? That small numbers of individuals was then lead to being included on reserve, trying to survive, making it on reserves, receiving annuities. And it was suggested during the Paulé trial that, in fact, by the Crown, it was suggested that the community of Sault Ste. Marie just vanished. It's no longer a Métis community. Are you kidding me? The Crown suggested. And they lost, now we know they've lost their argument up to the Supreme Court, still recognizing the Supreme Court that in Sault Ste. Marie there was a cultural transmission that was more sturdy than these attempts toward assimilation, and that Métis individuals, family, as well as the community could remain despite these facts discovered. So there's also the important quote from Dr. Saint-Onge and Potrochny, suggesting that most inhabitant and descendant of the fur trade families, it is suggested in their work, and I think it's a fantastic quote, most inhabitant and descendant of fur trade communities did not need to mobilize in such a fashion or take an overt identification on continuous basis, but we think they could have if needed to. They lived a Métis life even if they did not have the need, time, or inclination to articulate it loud or brand it with a label, end of quote. So these scholars are suggesting that there are possible Métis identities, even if you don't carry a flag to battle, put a gun and say, you know, with a sash, I am a Métis and I'm going to die today for it, right? In the Outaouais region especially, this is true, because most, as we have found evidence, and I will show you evidence of this in an instant, most of the Métis in the Maniwaki region were involved into trafficking fur against the company of the Hudson Bay Company, and they were also involved in contrabands of alcohol, okay, with their relative, the First Nation, which didn't have access to that market, and access often to cash or other material, because the Hudson Bay Company was controlling all the market and the product that could be accessible to the so-called Indians. So the Métis people were playing an intermediate role, not only in the Maniwaki region, but also out west. But this is observable in the Maniwaki region, among other regions. And basically, this form of activity needs solidarity. It needs form of identification. It needs other forms of mobilization that may not be the grand war on identity or resistance against the Canadian government, but more covert operation to survive and to carry on. So this is the 1850 treaties. Just a reminder in my slide that the Métis were not successful in Sault Ste. Marie. They were told to either assimilate with the white or to become Indians, and they suggested to the Ojibwe leadership, if you want the Métis, pick them up and put them in your band. We're not dealing with Métis or white people in terms of treaty. We're dealing with so-called Indians. So this is just a reminder of this to show that the juridical and the treaty making process was not favorable to Métis people or Métis community at that time. So this is just a reminder of these conditions by which the Métis were often thrown off between categories of being white or Indian and have hard decision to make in that regard. And finally, we know that they were excluded increasingly from legislative measures, starting from refusal to give the Métis any present, for example, that were reserved, or annuities that were reserved to the so-called Indians. And it became a formal decision in the Indian Act of 1876 that goes that no Métis could be considered as Indian. Now, a lot of people will say to me, well, Sebastian, we're not clear about that. What do you mean by Métis? Do you mean just mixed blood? Because there's a lot of so-called Indians that are also from mixed heritage. How can we make sense of this? And we are in preparation of some work right now where we suggest that it's a patrilineal coding that has been stored in place in terms of Métis identity versus the so-called Indians' identity. In a short, simple way, if your father was reputed as an Indian person, according to the law, then you were an Indian. But if your indigenous heritage comes from your mother, then suddenly you were falling out of that categories, that official colonial categories of Indianness, if you will. So the Métis, a lot of Métis found themselves on the peripheries of reserve-created annuities, present giving in the early 1800s. To the so-called Indians, and after that, when these treaties were taken away, or not taken away, but modified or not respected, as well as these present, the Métis found themselves completely on their own, basically, skirting often on the side of reserves. So, along these kind of problems show why we went for a more sturdy methodology along with these criteria to gather the evidence that we found, and we decided to move forward with this in terms of the evidence. So our methodology avoids the pitfall of recent nationalist ideologies that would push or brush off evidence that we need to investigate in our opinion. It opens up the territory under study for us, and we think it corresponds better with the diaspora of the Métis Canadian people and the English so-called half-breed of the fur trade circuit identity in terms of fluidity, in terms of colonialism and its impact, and in terms of Métis diversity. So we think that our model, our ethnological model in the grid that we use, is more respectful of the trajectory that the Métis had, historically speaking, as well as culturally speaking. It's more sensitive than taking a nationalistic story and suggest whatever don't fit into that nationalistic story or that narrative, we will cut off, basically. We kind of, our work is opposed to that view and wish to go a little bit further in details and hopefully rescue Métis communities that are lacking recognition at this point, as it is the case for the Métis community of Maniwaki, which are not recognized by the government of Quebec at this point, not the government of Canada as well, as they are basically on their own since their creation. Now, ethnic origin, common experience, cultural recognition, social structure, treaty, political element, geographic proximities, as well as material culture. I'm going to go really quickly into this in order to move on. So what we have attempted, Guillaume and I, in our article, but as well as the work we're doing right now with Dr. Michel Bouchard, is that for the grid that I have shown you, we have found primary evidence of all these criteria. So if we fill each of these criteria, then arguably we are in a good posture to suggest that there's a Métis community in the region that we're exploring. So here I have gathered, at lack of sleeping a few days, I must admit, because I had to retrieve everything from the archives with the help of Guillaume Marcotte. On ethnic origins, you have here, for example, the transcript of Joseph David. He's from Red River. He's a Métis person, but he resides in the Outaouais region. You can see here the word Métis, for example, but this is the kind of documents that we have to read as researcher in order to make sense of everything. So I just wanted to give you as well a feel of that research as we go along. This is the source if you want to find it. So we found that there are 60 households in the Vallée de la Gatineau, Lac Sainte-Marie, Lac des Sables, Maniwaki, in a 30-kilometer radius, if you will, circa around 1850. At this point, there's 19 Métis family that we have recorded at the very least, and that counts for around 200 individuals in that vicinity alone, which if you compare it to Sault Ste. Marie, for example, a little bit earlier, kind of provide a similar or even more sturdy population in terms of numbers. Common experience in individuals. So we have this document here that we've also located in the archives, which is the creation of the Lac Sainte Marie. Remember that point that I've put it on the map? This is the Lac Sainte Marie. This community was created by voyageurs and Métis coming back from the fur trade. Right in the Outaouais region. So including in that quote here, you find Mr. McPherson. Okay, so he's one of the creator of that community. And if you know your Métis history, George McPherson is pretty a great figure in Métis history. He was there as a witness for the signature of Treaty 3, for example. He's a well-known Métis, including recognized by the people in the Red River and other regions of Canada. So McPherson was present right in Sault Ste. Marie and had a relative living there in that community. So this is the quote that you find in that letter, because I won't make you suffer to read that by yourself, right? They have lately arrived in the vicinity. This is the HBC authorities panicking with the fact that these Métis and voyageurs that are now free men are creating communities. And the HBC hates that because they're losing control over trading with the so-called Indians when Métis are getting too close. And these people know the tricks of the trade, right? So there have arrived lately in vicinities of outpost Rivière-des-Elders, this is in Maniwaki, a crew of 5 or 6 apparently old voyageurs who give out that they came for the purpose of trade. As far as I can learn, Mr. McPherson, lately of Grand Lac, son and son-in-law, are of the number. When I will learn more particularly their intention, I shall write you more fully. In the meantime, I do not feel apprehensive of their being able to do much, or something like that. I'm sure you can read better with the distance than I'm like reading big letters next to me. So this tells you about the cultural productions of the Lac Sainte Marie, which is at the heart of that triangle that we've seen with Rivière-des-Elders, Maniwaki, and La Rivière-le-Lièvre. Cultural recognitions, points that are interesting by other people. We have Paul Riel, another Riel, an experienced canoeer, as well as experienced fur trade personnel. He went to help the Atikamekw people that were suffering from, not from, an epidemic at this point. The Indian agent calls Riel part Indian in his correspondence, so that shows you that the heritage of that person is considered not really an Indian, not really a white, he's part Indian. Now you have the Métis McDougall around the Maniwaki vicinities expulsing Manu Militari by his aunt, the Indian agent called Baudin. We have the quote here from that. And basically what it says is that the second day we arrived at a little house where lives a certain Jean-Baptiste McDougall, who has been treated as an Algonquin, though his father was an half-breed from the Christiano of Red River. So you can see that there's also connections between the people of Red River, the people of Grand Lac, the people of Sault Ste. Marie, where Marie-Louise Riel was born herself, and the people of Maniwaki, right? All these communities are interconnected by kinship and by a number of individuals, right? And you can see the Indian agent, so to speak, says, this guy is not an Algonquin. This guy is not an Indian. His father is an half-breed. His father is an half-breed, then he cannot be an Indian because per law and per the patrilineal model that colonial authority adopt, only if your father is reputed as an Indian, you may be a so-called Indians. Now, the self-ascribing potential of another evidence that we find about André Lacroix, stating that his children are de facto Métis because from from him and a woman reputed Indian. We have the evidence here, and basically that story is very interesting because that's a letter that Lacroix, a Canadien, right? He's not a Métis. He's married to an indigenous woman, and so their children are considered half-breed, right? Per logic of that time. And so his daughter married a First Nation man. And so by marrying a First Nation man, she becomes officially an Indian. But there's a mixed up for the colonial authorities at one point. So he writes a letter today to them saying, look, my children are half-breed Métis, but my daughter half-breed married that Indian man, and then she becomes a so-called Indians. And on that basis, she can access the reserve. Do you understand? So this is really interesting because we can see that Lacroix understands all of this in 1879. He understands all the grammars by which identity are derived and officially constructed, right? These are Canadian, these are half-breed, these are so-called Indians in the vicinity of Maniwaki again, which brings a distinctiveness to Métis identity versus so-called Indians or more respectably Algonquins. Social structures, quickly. This is a topo of John Snow, surveyor. He wrote in his carnet when he discovered the community of Lac Sainte-Marie. So this is a drawing that he did about the community of Lac Sainte-Marie in the Maniwaki vicinity. So John Snow, the same surveyor that went out west to map the land of the Métis, came back, and we found that there is a substantial numbers of these families that are Métis per the research that we did, and most of them, if not all of them, are linked to the fur trade, which arguably is the cultural hub of Métis ethnogenesis, the fur trade and its circuit and its ramification and its possibility to travel or being posted on different jobs within that fur trade network is what constitute the ground, if you will, for Métis cultures and different communities to emerge, okay? The political elements now that we found among our evidence, we found a petition here that reunite Métis people as well as non-Indigenous people signing together a petition. And in that petition, they call their population mixed. Mixed means that they have different elements into it, right? They had Métis, but they don't have so-called Indians because the Algonquins did sign a petition in their own name for the same problem in 1874. So you have a petition coming from the Algonquin about the same problem, agreeing with the settlers and the Métis, and then you have the settlers and the Métis co-signing a petition together, therefore describing their sub-community as mixed. Okay, so that's an interesting find in terms of petition that we did find. We find the correspondence of Father Nedelec in 1896, and that is most interesting. See the handwriting of Father Nedelec. Now I know it by heart, right? I went to 20 pages of this and more. So, and let me tell you, with our computers, we're not used to read that anymore, so that takes hours. Just saying. So the evidence is there. So that's very interesting, right? Because Father Nedelec wants to work for the Métis as well as he wants to work for the Algonquin. And what I wanted to say in a short time is that when reserves were created in 1850 in the eastern province of Canada, including Quebec and Ontario, okay? When these reserves are created, there's a lot of Métis coming from the fur trade that have indigenous ancestry from their mother's side or elsewhere in their family, and they're looking for accessing these reserves. Often they're close to, they're married, they have kinship, or often they just want opportunities, okay? So they want to access those reserves. And so there's tension and conflict between the Algonquin and the Métis about who's going to access the reserve, okay? So this is very cool for us because it show us that the Métis and the Algonquin have a different identity if they're colliding and if they're disputing or sometimes making deals about how to manage their affairs, right? Sometimes it's peaceful, sometimes it's more problematic. So Father Nedelec comes in and he wants the half-breed, so to speak, from below, from the Mattawa Triangle and region and larger, to access the Témiscamingue Reserve. And he writes to the government and says, please accept those so-called half-breed right in that reserve. And the government says, no, obviously. And the argument says that we will not provide the opportunity for the half-breed to form a community. That's in the official response, that's A. And B, the Algonquin are like, are you crazy as well? We don't know some of these people. I mean, we don't want any trouble. We want to manage our own affairs. So basically, this series of letters that makes for more than 20 pages show that there is political motivation to include the Métis within a reserve. I've translated that for your reading on your own time, but basically it suggests, so far, it suggests that father-in-elect was that give the half-breed 2 seats on the council. It went as far as offering political position to the Métis in the vicinities of Témiscamingue, only to the Métis in distinction to the Algonquin, to try to strike a balance in terms of that politics. Now, like I said, there's smuggling and free trade involving the family Saint-Denis and the No family of the Métis of that region. Here I did find the evidence, and I'm going to bring it forward if that's possible. French-Canadian relatives and friends. Okay, so here's the first part of it. There are about 10 licensed hotels and liquor shops, and though none are known to sell liquors direct to the Indians, there are no difficulties in getting it through their half-breed and that's the part on top, French, Canadian relatives and friends. But you see the distinction here? Like, I mean, if these guys were just so-called Indians, they wouldn't have taken the burden of saying distinctively and collectively Indians, half-breed, French Canadians. So see, you have 3 categories of people, 3 ethnicities in the vicinities of Maniwaki that coexist per this primary evidence of 1909 by Benson in his official correspondence to the government. Okay, so arguably that's interesting to us. Here you have the transcription of that if you want to read it on your own, or for helping you getting to that handwriting. So in terms of geographical proximity, that is the worst handwriting ever, I would think, by Father Bellefeuille in 1838, that describes, for our pleasure, this. So it's a long quote that suggests that in all of the Outaouais segment and the river, in all of these different posts, I quote, they are Métis, descendant of voyageurs or clerk, bourgeois, Canadien, or Scottish of the most part. These Métis are usually more clever than the others. Okay, well, that's just a prejudice of the time I'm suggesting. I didn't put it in there, I swear. But basically, you can see that in terms of the geographical proximities and in terms of its distribution, we have evidence from that region in 1838 that there are Métis families consisting of a population that are active in the different forts and posts of trade. Now, in terms of culture matérielle, as we say in French, I chose 3 evidence to show you that there are practices that are cultural that links also to Marie-Louise Riel in terms of creating moccasins and as well as fabricating beach bark canoe. You have François No and his wife Macpherson that order from the HBC vermillon, and the vermillon, that red powder, you know, is used by the First Nations to color either bones or clothes or jewelry. They're very traditional practices, so it shows that there is still a strong connection there. This is the list from the HBC that we did find. There's moccasin from the McGregor family. That's directly the family of Marie-Louise Riel. They're manufacturing moccasin en masse. As we said, this is the list that we found about their creating moccasin as well as other indigenous pieces of equipment and Métis. And finally, Ambroise Beaulieu, also Métis from Lac des Sables that we've seen it among our triangle, is selling beach bark canoe to the HBC to pay old debts, okay? So here you find this evidence right here as well in the document. So all of these documents suggest that there's cultural, physical activities that are going about, and I have provided each evidence with their places where to find them in the archives as well. So see here, if we go back to it, I don't know if you can, anyways, it doesn't let me scope it except if I go manually. Prezi is fantastic for that. But look, here we got application and example, ethnic origin, common experience, cultural recognition, social structure, political element, geographic proximities, and material culture. So just by a sample alone, we have provided primaries evidence that there is something like a culture happening in that area in which Marie-Louise Riel gravitate around, which is all of that taken together. If we go back to the arguments of Chris Andersen suggesting that there's nothing alive, that there's no evidence, yes, it's true. We had to dig archives in order to provide proof because we are challenged by a number of actors, governmental as well as academic actors, that are suggesting you have no evidence that you are a Michif, that you are a Métis person in the eastern province of Canada. And then when these people are saying, yes, we are Michif, these actors will say to them, we don't believe you. You're lying. You're either lying or you're lying to yourself or your ancestor have lied to you. You're not a Michif. You're just a mixed something, okay? You're just like, you're not national, you're nothing. So when we put these evidence together, we find that there is the clearer picture of a culture that exists, a culture of Michif connected to the fur trade, connected to Sault Ste. Marie, connected to the Grand Lac, connected to the Témiscamingue, connected to the Abitibi, connected to the Red River core, through families such as the Paul, the descendant of the ancestor of Serge Paul, the chief, right in the back here. His own ancestor was connected to the Gaudry family, okay? And not only to the Gaudry family, but other Red River families, the David, for example, that escaped together from the clutch of the HBCs in Lake Winnipeg, and they find themselves living together next kins and next house right in Maniwaki vicinities. So there are a number of connections that we can make that prove that not only there is a history for Métis culture in the Maniwaki region per evidence based on a comparative basis, but furthermore, there are oral traditions that are still vivid to this day that are telling that history. Now, some people have suggested to me that, Sebastian, all good and pretty, but you have no evidence that the Algonquin, the Algonquin people, the Anishinaabe, are not recognizing you. They are saying, some are saying, not all of them obviously, but some suggest that there are no evidence that the Anishinaabe or the Algonquin did recognize Métis in their territory. How could that be? If there were Métis, the Anishinaabe would have, spoke about this reality. Well, we did find petitions from the Algonquins in 1874. Here's the label. Suggested that there are French half-breed as well as Scottish half-breeds in their vicinities, and they do not wish these guys to come on their reserve. Okay, so they go to Ottawa with a petition and they say, these French half-breeds and these Scottish half-breeds, we're not happy with them going up north a bit. So that shows not only some point of tension per resources that are getting shorter and shorter with the advance of colonial laws and practices, so hence the conflict between different indigenous actors, we could suggest. But it shows that there's different categories of ethnicities that are thought and perceived. Here we have also the elder and wampum carrier, William Comenda, on the Métis in Quebec, writing an articles, and that's very interesting, right? Writing this article in 1970, saying that there's a need for the Métis people of Quebec and the Indian people of Quebec, as well as the Québécois, to partake to these bridging initiative by which we can have more justice. So William Comenda was explicitly recognizing in this articles that we have the Métis people of Quebec. So this is a well-known Anishinaabe leader, as I have just stated. So there's a second evidence that that the Anishinaabe people did recognize the presence of the Métis within their territory. In 2004, also, there's this book made by a scholar named McGregor, Anishinaabe scholar, that suggested that the Algonquin joined it up with the Métis, Irish, and Scottish lumberjack, right, in the development of the lumber industries. And they worked at the lumber camp. It was hard, hours were long, exhausting, and the money meager, but steady. Okay, so the tree population are quite identified here. So we have at least 3 evidence. That's just a sample of the 3 evidence. The Algonquin making a petition in 1874 identifying the Métis in their petitions among other ethnicities. We have the elder and wampum carrier William Comenda, and finally we have also a history book written by a scholar, Algonquin scholar McGregor, stating also the presence of Métis in their vicinities. I'm closing with this because I think this is interesting. But what about cultural continuity? It's well saying good. What about like this period between the 18th century and now? Well, we find Father Guinard speaking on the métis of the region, right in this evidence that I can show, on trapping permit with a special price for the Métis vis-a-vis the so-called Indians. This is in also the 40s. And on Métis fighting for their constitutional right in 1981. So I'm just going to glide really quickly into these evidence because I've put so much effort in trying to put them together. Father Guinard here, this is his picture, and this is his handwriting. Yes, I know. And you can find here the word Métis, distinguish it from Indians as well as other Canadians living in the vicinity of La Rivière-le-Lièvre. And he recognized that they are a three-parted population, like in any Métis communities across Canada and the United States. Indian, Métis, and whites are living together in different communities. And here is a description of the Métis that Father Guinard is doing in 1946 in the region of Maniwaki. Like the Indians, these Métis love to hunt the forest and have a very well-developed sense of orientation, even at night. Our immersed forest cannot lead them astray. They find what they need to live where the whites would die out of starvation and so on. So he's making a clear description of the Métis that are like the Indians but are not the Indians, therefore describing again a different form of identity in the region. There are this letter that we did find in the archive stating that trapping license of special price should be given only to the Indian and the whites as well as the half-breed in the vicinities of Maniwaki are to be given another price, again identifying collectively and distinctively Métis. And finally, there is, in closing, these two articles that I want to show you. This is in 1985. This is a testimony from in the Journal L'Alliance from a person named Marie-Louise Riel. Her name is Riel. She's a Métis living in Maniwaki, and she described how hard it is to be named Riel and how hard it was during her young time to be labeled a Métis or a demi-sauvage or these kinds of words. And you have her full quote here. I am called Marie-Joseph Riel in English, my translation. For those who are close to me, Riel for me was a character who lived in the history of Canada, first as a traitor, then as a hero. He is my brother, my father, my ancestor. Okay? He is someone who made me cry, someone I detested, then I loved. To live one's childhood in a little village close to Ottawa in 1947 when one is called Riel is not a lot of fun most days. At school, when I was in the first grade, the oldest children, that is to say, those who were in grade 3 and 4, treated me as a traitor, pushed me around, and I did not know why. I would return home crying. I would have really wanted to be called something else at that moment. So you can see here that there's living traditions that are now the traditions of Elder being transmitted, and we have evidence of this. So we truly wonder at this point, how can a scholar or any scholar may suggest that there's no living tradition, nothing at all that can prove that in Quebec there are Métis culture that may have survived, that are in a process of resilience? How can you say that without reviewing at first the evidence? It's what we would suggest. Now, this is an article that we did find also in a newspaper, local newspaper, describing the battles that the Métis have at this point in regards of the Constitution of Canada, remember in 1982, right? So this article shows Les Métis de la région du Pontiac-Labelle. This is the Ottawa region. It's here, okay? It's the region of the Maniwaki, essentially. That's what I'm trying to say, okay? So here I have the format translation for you in English. The Métis of the région Pontiac-Labelle, Outaouais, met to discuss together the rights that they want to see enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. So there you got like political, pre-Pauli, pre-Constitution, a group of organized Métis that are talking about this. The lands where our ancestors trapped and hunted were the properties of companies often foreign. For us, Mr. Commissioner, this situation is unacceptable and demonstrates clearly our situation as squatter in our own land. Okay, so you have Métis here mobilizing themselves in 1981, resisting the labeling of squatters and wanting their trapping rights to be recognized in the territory. So you have the lifestyle, you have the practices, you have an oral tradition, you have political mobilization pre-constitution. We have gathered a list of evidence primary to fill a series of scientific criteria on a comparative basis for an ethnological analysis, suggesting that not only there is a flourishing culture happening there, but the question, the more profound question we can ask ourselves in closing, and that's for real, I know that I've said closing so many times now, nobody believes me anymore on this. So the question that is the most important one that we're facing at this point in terms of scholarship work, in terms of conversation, in terms of what we want to create for future generation in terms of narrative, we have to gather, we have to be respectful of evidence. And we have to suggest that if we don't know a phenomenon, we should not negate it before carefully studying it, especially in relationship to indigenous population that may be at risk, especially in case of Métis people that may have struggled for years, as we have seen in the different testimonies, for their own recognitions, suffering from sometimes violence, abuse, and misrecognitions. To suggest that these people have no history, to suggest that these people are not worth it, that are only race shifter, that are only racist people, covert white supremacist, is, in our opinion, per the evidence that we're seeing, a very dangerous maneuver at this point. It risks, and I'm going to try to be as subtle as I can with this, it risks the continuation of what has been labeled a cultural genocide. Okay? If you are going about indigenous communities that are struggling for recognition, and you are doing some work without seeing the evidence, without interviewing elders, without seeing this community face to face, you are at risk of keeping up these colonial traditions of erasure, of assimilation, and of destruction. So I hope that this conference may steer us in a different direction, and I hope that this conversation will provide more positive and constructive comments in the future toward that community. I thank you so much for your patience, and I apologize for the late start as well as the technical difficulties. Thank you so much.